The gas lamps along Fifth Avenue were still burning in the early hours of 1883, casting pale circles of amber light onto cobblestones made slick by a cold March rain. A carriage moved slowly northward past the brownstone facades of the upper 50s, its iron wheels producing a low and continuous sound against the wet stone. The city at that hour was suspended in particular stillness that settles over a very large place in the final hours before dawn, when coal smoke hangs low above the rooftops and the usual sounds of commerce have not yet resumed. New York in the 1880s was a city in the process of becoming something it had not been before. The Civil War had ended less than 2 decades earlier, and in the interval that followed, the industrial machinery of an entire continent had begun producing private wealth on a scale that had no genuine precedent in American experience. The railroad networks that now cover more than 100,000 miles of track across the country had made certain men enormously, almost abstractly rich. The steel mills of Pittsburgh, the oil refineries of western Pennsylvania, and the banking houses of lower Manhattan were generating fortunes of a magnitude that defied easy comprehension, even for those who possessed them. The families who controlled this wealth were engaged in a project as much social as it was financial. They were constructing a world within the existing world, with its own geography, its own seasonal calendar, its own precise and unwritten codes of conduct, and its own carefully maintained systems of inclusion and exclusion. The physical evidence of this project was most visible along the upper stretches of Fifth Avenue, where, in the space of a few city blocks, the largest private residences ever built on the North American continent were rising, one after another, from the cold ground. The twin brownstone mansions that William Henry Vanderbilt completed at 645th Avenue in 1882 occupied the full frontage of a city block between 51st and 52nd Streets, and they stood, at the time of their completion, as the most expensive private residences constructed on the island of Manhattan. The project had consumed approximately $2 million in construction costs alone, a figure that stood entirely apart from the additional $1.5 million William Henry Vanderbilt had committed to assembling the art collection that would hang in the purpose-built galleries within. The building was faced in a warm reddish-brown sandstone quarry from the Connecticut River Valley, and the Herder brothers of New York had overseen the interior decoration, covering the walls of the principal rooms with carved wood paneling, painted ceilings, and imported marble until the whole interior had the character of a private institution rather than a private home. When the mansion opened to a limited number of invited visitors in early 1883, it was received with that mixture of admiration and discomfort that would come to characterize the public response to this class of building throughout the 2 decades that followed. William Henry Vanderbilt had inherited the bulk of his father Cornelius Vanderbilt's fortune in 1877, receiving approximately $90 million in railroad stock in cash, and he more than doubled that figure over the following 8 years through careful management of the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. He was not, by most contemporary accounts, a man of theatrical social instincts. The phrase most persistently attributed to him, "the public be damned," reported after an exchange with Chicago journalists in 1882, suggested a person more absorbed by the mechanisms of his enterprise than by its public presentation. The generation that followed him was considerably more ambitious. His son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who would inherit control of the railroad empire, and his son, William Kissam Vanderbilt, whose wife, Alva Smith Vanderbilt, would prove one of the most effective social strategists of the era, would carry the Vanderbilt name into the most extreme registers of Gilded Age display. Fifth Avenue north of 50th Street had, by the mid-1880s, established itself as the primary address for families wishing to make a visible claim to membership in New York's most exclusive social tier. The Astor family, whose fortune derived from Manhattan real estate holdings accumulated across several generations and whose social position predated the railroad age entirely, maintained their principal residence near 34th Street in a pair of brownstone houses whose drawing rooms had long served as an informal court of social arbitration for the city's established elite. The Belmont and Gilded families, along with a succession of newly arrived industrial fortunes, occupied the blocks between 50th and 70th Streets with a series of commissioned buildings, each intended to communicate something specific and legible about the nature of their owner's wealth. The architect, who more than any other defined the visual character of the stretch of the avenue during its most productive building decade, was Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to have trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where it studied between 1846 and 1853, who became the most sought-after residential designer in New York, and whose work shaped the architectural aspirations of the elite building program for nearly 2 decades. Hunt's sustained relationship with the Vanderbilt family produced the most extensively documented domestic buildings of the entire Gilded Age. He had designed the facade of the William Kissam Vanderbilt mansion at 665th Avenue, completed in 1882, in the manner of the French Renaissance chateaux of the Loire Valley, and it attracted immediate attention for its departure from the prevailing brownstone character of the surrounding blocks. His subsequent commissions in Newport, Rhode Island, the Marble House and the Breakers, were on a scale and at a level of internal finish that has remained without parallel in the history of American domestic architecture. Hunt died in August of 1895, the same year the Breakers was completed, and the building stands today as a summation of his career's central ambition. The furnishings and art that filled the interiors of these houses were acquired at costs that, in several documented cases, approached or exceeded the buildings themselves. William Henry Vanderbilt's collection at 645th Avenue included paintings purchased from the estates of European collectors and from the principal Paris dealers, among them Goupil and Company, and contemporary newspaper accounts valued the collection as a whole at figures ranging between $1 and $2 million. The collecting practices of the wealthiest families in the 1880s and 90s combined genuine aesthetic interest with a form of calculated social positioning. To be seen bidding at the Hotel Drouot in Paris for a Meissonier or a Bouguereau was to place oneself within a tradition of European connoisseurship that carried cultural authority well beyond the monetary value of any individual object. The furnishings that accompanied these paintings, the Aubusson carpets, the Sèvres porcelain, the Louis Quinze commodes and marquetry cabinets, were acquired through the same Paris and London dealers who supplied the residences of European royalty, and the families who purchased them were generally content to have that connection known. The Breakers, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II on a cliff-top parcel at Ochre Point in Newport, and completed in 1895 at an estimated construction cost of $7 million, contained 70 rooms distributed across 4 full stories of Italian Renaissance limestone. The dining room measured 42 feet by 58 feet and was finished in a combination of alabaster, imported marble, and gilded plasterwork, with a ceiling painted to suggest an open loggia beneath the sky in the manner of an Italian Renaissance palazzo. The billiards room on the upper floor was paneled in carved walnut and lit by stained glass windows facing north to capture the diffuse light of the coastal summer mornings. The kitchen, located in the basement and connected to the dining room above by a dedicated service stair, was equipped with 2 full cooking ranges, refrigeration rooms maintained at a controlled temperature throughout the season, and a hanging of copper kitchen vessels graduated in size along the walls. To describe the Breakers as a house is to use a word that does not quite reach its actual character. It functioned more nearly as a small hotel, operating according to an internal logic entirely separate from the rhythms of ordinary domestic life. Marble House, completed in 1892 on Bellevue Avenue in Newport for Alva Vanderbilt and her husband William Kissam Vanderbilt, had cost approximately $11 million by the time construction, and furnishings were fully accounted for, making it the most expensive private residence built in the United States to that date. Richard Morris Hunt had modeled the exterior on the Petit Trianon at Versailles, using a pale Westchester marble that required several years of quarrying and preparation before construction could begin. The gold room on the principal floor, a ballroom lined in gilded bronze relief panels and pilasters, lit by chandeliers that contemporary accounts described as casting the space in a warm and diffuse light similar to candle flame, could accommodate several hundred guests on the occasions when Alva Vanderbilt chose to open the house for large entertainments. She would later describe Marble House as belonging unambiguously and entirely to herself alone, a statement that carried particular resonance in a social world where married women's practical authority over property remained, in most legal respects, quite limited. Newport, Rhode Island, had served as a summer destination for prosperous American families since the early decades of the 19th century, and the town's mild coastal climate and accessibility by rail from New York and Boston had long made a preferred retreat from the inland summer heat. What changed in the 1880s was not the destination, but the scale and character of what was being built there. The modest villas and boarding houses of the antebellum summer colony were replaced, in the space of roughly 15 years, by estates of 30, 40, and 50 rooms set on consolidated parcels of coastal farmland behind stone walls and iron fences that separated them from the public roads as definitively as any natural boundary. The local designation for these buildings remained cottages, a word their owners applied with consistent matter-of-factness, and that outside observers frequently cited as a small but revealing index of a social world that preferred a vocabulary of modesty even when describing its most immodest productions. Bellevue Avenue and the surrounding streets in Newport contained, by the mid-1890s, a concentration of private architectural ambition without precedent in the United States. Ochre Court, completed in 1892 for Ogden Goelet and designed by Richard Morris Hunt, rose 5 full stories above its ocean-facing lawn and contained 52 rooms finished in carved limestone, whose principal halls were proportioned after the great rooms of French aristocratic residences. Rosecliff, designed by Stanford White for Teresa Fair Ulrichs and completed in 1902, was modeled on the Grand Trianon at Versailles and built around a ballroom intended to receive 400 guests without crowding. Belcourt Castle, also designed by Hunt for Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont and completed in 1894, devoted its entire ground floor to a stable and carriage house capable of accommodating 30 horses, a plan that reflected the sustained importance of fine horsemanship and carriage driving to elite social identity throughout the period. The Newport summer season ran from approximately the final week of June to the first days of September, and during those 10 weeks a pattern of daily social life followed a schedule as fixed and as precisely observed as any commercial calendar. Mornings were marked by the appearance of the great coaches and phaetons on Bellevue Avenue, their occupants making their way to the Newport Casino, built in 1880 by the firm of McKim, Mead and White for James Gordon Bennett Jr., and serving as the informal social headquarters of the summer colony for lawn tennis, light luncheon, and a particular kind of structured conversation that served as the primary medium of social exchange throughout the period. Afternoons were given to carriage drives along the cliff walk or to the practice of calling visits, in which the established ritual of leaving or receiving a pasteboard visiting card at the entrance of each house on one social list fulfilled a function that was simultaneously social and political. The cards accumulating in the silver tray in a cottage entrance hall formed a legible record of who had acknowledged whom, and the absence of a card where one had been expected could produce social consequences entirely out of proportion to the small physical object whose absence had caused them. Beyond the Newport colony, the geography of Gilded Age private wealth extended along the Hudson River Valley and into more distant regions of the country. Jay Gould, the railroad and telegraph financier whose reputation for market aggression had made him one of the most discussed and least socially welcome of the great industrial fortunes, had purchased Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, New York, in 1880, a Gothic revival manor on the eastern bank of the Hudson River designed in an earlier era by the architect Alexander Jackson Davis. Gould expanded the property substantially, adding greenhouses along the western side of the house, extended more than 300 feet in length and containing, by the time of his death in 1892, one of the largest private orchid collections in the United States. At the furthest geographic extreme of all stood Biltmore, built by George Washington Vanderbilt II, near Asheville, North Carolina, on approximately 100,000 acres of Blue Ridge Mountain countryside. Richard Morris Hunt designed the main house in the style of a Loire Valley chateau, and the building was completed in 1895 at an estimated cost of $6 million, containing 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. To supply the estate with its own food and manage timber, George Vanderbilt engaged Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect responsible for Central Park in New York and Prospect Park in Brooklyn, to plan the grounds and establish a working agricultural and forestry operation on the surrounding land, a commission that Olmsted considered among the most comprehensive of his 4-decade career. The domestic operation of any one of these great properties required a permanent staff whose internal organization bore more resemblance to a military hierarchy than to the household arrangements of an ordinary prosperous family. The breakers during the Vanderbilt family's summer occupancy employed approximately 40 servants drawn from a combination of year-round resident staff and seasonal additions, and the structure within that group was precise and fixed by long convention. The butler held senior authority over the male household staff. The footmen who served at table, the pantry man responsible for the china and silver, and the hall boy who managed the front entrance and the reception of visitors. The housekeeper held equivalent standing over the female staff. The housemaids responsible for cleaning the principal rooms, the kitchen maids working under the direction of the cook, and the ladies' maids attending individually to each female member of the family. A lady's maid of genuine skill and discretion was a significant professional asset to any great household, responsible for the care of a wardrobe that might run to 40 or more separate gowns across a single Newport season, each requiring careful storage, regular pressing, and occasional repair after the demands of a heavy social calendar. The physical architecture of these houses reflected and reinforced the social logic that governed their daily operation. Parallel service corridors ran throughout the house behind the principal rooms, and back staircases connected the basement kitchens and service storage to the pantries adjacent to the dining rooms without passing through any space used by the family or their guests. A dinner for 30 guests might require the coordinated effort of 12 or more servants moving through this shadow infrastructure in a sequence timed with considerable care, delivering courses and clearing between removes without any visible trace of their movement reaching the dining room table. Footmen serving at table in the more formal establishments wore livery, coat, knee breeches, and in the most traditional houses a powdered wig, and were often selected partly on the basis of height, since matching footmen of equivalent stature produced a visual uniformity considered appropriate to the character of the room they served. What these buildings created, taken together, was a distinct physical world that overlapped with but remained genuinely separate from the rest of American life, a world with its own geography, its own seasonal rhythms, its own internal hierarchies, and its own carefully maintained mechanisms for distinguishing those who belonged from those who did not. The managing of that distinction, its rituals, its unwritten rules, and its occasional disruptions was conducted not in boardrooms but in ballrooms and at dinner tables and in the colonnaded entrance halls of Newport cottages, where those who had been admitted and those who had not were separated by nothing more substantial and nothing less powerful than a name on a calling list. The social world that these houses served was organized according to a calendar as precisely maintained and as strictly observed as any commercial or legal schedule, and it divided the year into segments of obligation and release with clarity that left very little room for improvisation or individual deviation. The New York season ran from October to the beginning of Lent in February or March, and during those months the city's elite rotated through a fixed sequence of events: the Opera, the Academy of Music on 14th Street, and later at the Metropolitan Opera House that opened in 1883 on Broadway and 39th Street, the subscription dinner series at Delmonico's restaurant on Fifth Avenue, the private balls and at-home evenings in the principal drawing rooms of the Avenue, whose scheduling, guest lists, and internal hierarchies were matters of collective attention that absorbed a substantial portion of the energy of the families who participated in them. The Newport season, as has been established, absorbed the months between late June and early September. Between those two poles, the households made their biannual migrations, moving the family, the domestic staff, and a considerable volume of personal property between the city and the coast in a logistical exercise that was itself, in its scale and its precision, a form of social display. The established families against whose standards all newcomers were measured derived their authority not from the scale of their current income, but from the duration and character of their connection to New York and to each other. The Knickerbocker families, a term referring broadly to the Old Dutch and English colonial families of the Hudson River Valley and Lower Manhattan. Names such as Livingston, Van Rensselaer, Stuyvesant, Schuyler, and Schermerhorn had accumulated their social position across generations of intermarriage, consistent attendance at the right churches, and a set of social habits whose power derived precisely from the length of time they had been practiced without visible variation. The novelist Edith Wharton, born Edith Newbold Jones in 1862 into one of these established New York families, and later one of the most precise chroniclers of the Gilded Age social world, described old New York's social code in her memoir, A Backward Glance, as a system built on the careful management of the familiar, in which the introduction of anything genuinely new was met with a collective wariness that went well beyond mere conservatism and approached something more like constitutional resistance. Their wealth by the 1880s was in many cases considerably less than that of the industrial families pressing against the boundaries of their circle, but the distinction they drew between themselves and the newcomers was not primarily a distinction of money. It was a distinction of manner of association and of the particular quality of ease that can only be produced by long habit and cannot, in any direct way, be acquired through expenditure. The person who did more than any other individual to codify this social system, to give an explicit structure, a set of articulable rules, and a degree of institutional formality that it had previously lacked, was a Georgia-born lawyer and social figure named McAllister, who had arrived in New York in the 1860s and spent the following 2 decades establishing himself as the foremost acknowledged authority on the proper conduct of elite social life. McAllister was a man of moderate personal fortune, but considerable social intelligence, and he understood that in a world organized around the management of prestige and access, genuine authority could be constructed from expertise and proximity rather than from wealth or lineage alone. He had traveled at length in Europe, had observed the mechanisms of the English and French aristocratic social seasons with focused attention, and had returned to New York carrying a set of ideas about how the city's elite social world should be organized that found a receptive audience among the families who stood to benefit from the clarity and exclusivity that a formal system would provide. He published his observations and recollections in a volume titled Society, as I Have Found It, in 1890, a work whose candid descriptions of the social machinery he had helped to construct were received with a mixture of amusement and mild embarrassment by the society it depicted, and which stands today as one of the more useful first-hand accounts of the period's social arrangements. By the early 1870s, McAllister had become the organizing force behind what he called the Patriarchs, a committee of 25 men drawn from the most established New York families, each responsible for inviting 4 women and 5 men to subscription balls that he organized under that name at Delmonico's restaurant on Fifth Avenue. The Patriarchs' balls, held several times each winter season, were the most formally prestigious social events in New York during the 1870s and 1880s, and an invitation to them was understood as an explicit public statement of social standing rather than a merely convivial gesture. The system operated through a logic of guaranteed exclusivity. To be invited to a Patriarch's ball was to be vouched for by at least one member of the committee, and to attend was to enter a room in which every other person had been similarly vouched for, producing a company whose collective validation was more socially valuable than any private dinner or drawing room reception could have provided on its own. McAllister managed the system with considerable political skill, understanding that its authority rested on perception that its boundaries were firm, and at the moment those boundaries became visibly negotiable, the entire structure would begin to lose a particular quality that made membership in it worth pursuing. His most famous formulation of the system's underlying logic came in a statement reported in the New York Tribune in 1888, in which he observed that there were only about 400 people in fashionable New York society, reasoning that if one went outside that number, one encountered people who were either not at ease in a ballroom or who made other people not at ease. The figure of 400 was not purely arbitrary. It corresponded approximately to capacity of the ballroom in the Fifth Avenue residence of Mrs. William Backhouse Astor, Jr., who was by that point the acknowledged social sovereign of the city's most exclusive circle, and whose opinion on the subject of any given family's social standing was, within the world that recognized her authority, effectively final. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor had married into the Astor family in 1853 and had spent the following 3 decades consolidating a position of social authority that rested on impeccable lineage. The Schermerhorns were among the oldest Dutch colonial families in New York, a very large income from the Astor real estate holdings, and a personal force of will that contemporaries consistently described in terms suggesting something between admiration and apprehension. Mrs. Astor occupied the upper floors of the Astor double mansion near 34th Street and Fifth Avenue, while her son and his wife occupied the lower portion. Her ballroom, when the furniture was arranged for dancing, received approximately 400 guests, and it was in this room, on the evening of the first Monday in January each year, that she held her annual ball, the single most socially significant event in the New York calendar, an invitation to which constituted definitive confirmation of one's standing in the elite social world, and whose absence from one's mantelpiece was equally definitive in its implications. The ball was preceded each season by Mrs. Astor's annual dinner for a smaller company, at which she appeared wearing the full Astor jewels, a collection that included a diamond stomacher and ropes of pearls so extensively described in newspaper accounts of the period that their specific character became a kind of familiar institutional symbol, as recognizable in its way as any official insignia of public office. She received her guests from a position near the entrance to the ballroom, and it was noted by those who had attended more than once that she conducted these receptions with quality of composed authority that required no particular effort to maintain, having been practiced and refined over a sufficient number of seasons to have become entirely natural to its bearer. The mechanism by which social recognition was formally extended or withheld in this world was a calling card, a small pasteboard rectangle printed with the bearer's name and sometimes their address, deposited in the silver tray in the entrance hall of each house on one social list during prescribed calling hours of the early afternoon. The rituals surrounding the card were elaborate and precisely understood by everyone who participated in them. A card left in person during calling hours carried considerably more weight than one sent with a servant. A card bent at one of its corners communicated specific intentions about the nature and purpose of the call, and the failure to return a call within a specified interval, generally understood to be approximately 2 weeks, was taken as a deliberate social withdrawal whose meaning was as legible to its recipient as any spoken declaration. For the wives of newly arrived fortunes, the accumulation of returned cards from the right addresses was a project that could occupy years of sustained social labor, and the failure of a particular name to appear in one's card tray was a datum as significant in its social register as any development in the family's financial affairs. The tension between the established families and the industrial newcomers was the central drama of New York social life throughout the 1880s, and it produced a series of maneuvers and countermaneuvers as carefully calculated as any corporate negotiation. Women such as Mrs. Perron Stevens, the wife of the hotel magnate who had assembled a considerable fortune from the hotel trade, but had not yet secured the social recognition she considered appropriate to it, spent years working carefully at the margins of the elite circle, hosting dinners for those whose own standing was sufficiently secure that their attendance conferred a degree of legitimation on the occasion, and waiting for the moment when the circle would acknowledge her on terms she found satisfactory. August Belmont, the American representative of the Rothschild banking house and among the most politically connected men in New York Democratic Party circles, occupied a peculiar position within this landscape. His fortune was beyond question, and his connections extensive, but his European birth and his Jewish background placed him in a social category whose precise relationship to the Knickerbocker establishment required continuous renegotiation throughout his long career in the city. The social commentator Frederick Townsend Martin, whose memoir, The Passing of the Idle Rich, was published in 1911, and whose own family connections gave him an insider's access to the world he described, observed that the distinctions maintained by the social system were understood by everyone who participated in them to be essentially artificial, and that their power derived not from any inherent logic, but from the collective agreement to behave as though they were natural and permanent. It was Alva Vanderbilt who resolved the central social question of the decade, whether the Vanderbilt fortune, vast as it undeniably was, could purchase entry into Mrs. Astor's circle on terms of genuine equality, through a maneuver that combined precise social intelligence with quality of cheerful ruthlessness that struck contemporaries as both admirable and slightly alarming. In the winter of 1882 and 1883, Alva Vanderbilt was completing plans for a costume ball to inaugurate her new mansion at 665th Avenue, designed for 1,200 guests and whose preparation had been underway for several months. Among those expected to attend was a group of young women who had been rehearsing an elaborate quadrille specifically for the occasion, a rehearsal in which Carrie Astor, daughter of Mrs. William Backhouse Astor Jr., was a principal participant. The difficulty was that Alva Vanderbilt had not been formally acknowledged by Mrs. Astor. No calling card had arrived at 665th Avenue. No invitation to any Astor entertainment had been issued. In the strict logic of the social system, a hostess could not in good conscience invite a guest whose mother had not yet called. Alva let it be known, through the appropriate channels, that Carrie Astor could not be included among the invited guests under these circumstances. Within days of this communication reaching its destination, Mrs. Astor's card arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion. The question that War McAllister had been managing from a careful distance for 2 decades had been decided in an afternoon. The ball itself was held on the evening of the 26th of March, 1883, and was attended by approximately 1,200 guests in costume, and an estimated total cost of the host of $250,000 when music, flowers, decorations, and supper were accounted for. The guests arrived in costumes representing historical personages and allegorical figures of considerable elaboration, several of which had been designed and made in Paris over preceding months. The evening included a series of quadrille figures performed by groups who had been rehearsing their movements for weeks, among them the Star Quadrille and the Hobby Horse Quadrille, whose participants had spent more time on their preparations than many professional theatrical productions of the period would have required. War McAllister attended dressed as Count de la Mole, a choice he had presumably selected with some awareness of its symbolic resonances. The morning newspapers gave the event extensive coverage, largely admiring in tone, and the effect on the social landscape was precisely what Alva Vanderbilt had intended. The family moved from that evening forward into the first rank of New York social life, and Mrs. Astor's implicit acknowledgment of their standing was as binding within the world that recognized her authority as any formal instrument of recognition could have been. The person who most visibly occupied the role of social entertainer in the Newport of the 1890s and early 1900s was Harry Lair, born Henry Symes Lair in Baltimore in 1869, who arrived in the summer colony in the mid-1890s and established himself, with some speed, as its most reliably amusing and most carefully observed social presence. Lair possessed no significant personal fortune and no family name of any particular distinction, but he had a quality that the very rich have found difficult to supply from within their own ranks in most eras of history. He was genuinely and consistently entertaining, capable of producing the kind of wit and social animation that transformed the dinner table from an obligatory ritual into something approaching actual pleasure. He was befriended by Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, Marion Graves Anthon Fish, wife of the Illinois Central Railroad executive Stuyvesant Fish and one of the most competitive hostesses of the Newport season, who used his talents as a resource in the unending contest for social precedence among the great summer houses, and who provided him with a standing in the colony that his circumstances alone would not have supported. His wife, Elizabeth Drexel Lair, whom he married in 1901, later published a memoir titled King Lair and the Gilded Age that offer an account of Newport's social life from an observation point as close to its center as any such record provides, and whose portrait of the Newport world is marked by a level of specific detail that only sustained personal proximity could have produced. What War McAllister had built across 2 decades of careful social architecture, and what the Vanderbilt Ball of 1883 had so dramatically illustrated, was a system whose apparent rigidity concealed a fundamental adaptability. The adaptability that any system of social control requires if it is to accommodate the irresistible pressure of very large amounts of money seeking legitimation. The rules of the 400 were not, in the end, the rules of a closed hereditary caste. They were the rules of a competitive social market, and the most successful participants in that market were those who understood the difference between the letter of the code and the practical logic that underlay it. It was this logic of entertainment, of spectacle, of the deliberate performance of abundance for an audience that was itself performing abundance, that found its most concentrated and most telling expression not in the ballroom, but at the dinner table, where the rituals of the Gilded Age elite displayed, in the most direct and literal sense, exactly what their wealth had made possible. The formal dinner, as it was practiced in the private dining rooms and at the subscription tables of the Gilded Age elite, was not primarily a social occasion in any relaxed or casual sense of that term. It was a performance, structured, sequenced, and governed by a set of procedural requirements whose complexity and precision served the same communicative function as the architecture of the rooms in which it was conducted, to demonstrate, through the management of an elaborate and costly event, that the household hosting it possessed not merely the money to bear the expense, but the knowledge and the refinement to deploy that money according to standards understood to be beyond the reach of the merely wealthy. War McAllister, who had spent a considerable portion of his career codifying and propagating these standards, described the ideal dinner in society, as I found it, as an occasion of no more than 8 or 10 persons attended with such care that the mechanical elements, the service, the wines, the succession of dishes, should become entirely invisible, leaving only the impression of an effortless perfection whose achievement, though in fact requiring days of preparation and the coordinated effort of a trained kitchen and dining room staff, appear to have required nothing at all. The restaurant at which these ideals were most publicly expressed, and at which the private standards of the great households were tested and extended in a semi-public setting, was Delmonico's. The establishment, founded on William Street in Lower Manhattan in 1827 by the Swiss brothers John and Peter Delmonico, and developed through the following decades by their nephew Lorenzo Delmonico into an institution that had no genuine American predecessor and few equivalents in any city in the world. Lorenzo Delmonico had hired the chef Charles Ranhofer in 1862, and under Ranhofer's direction over the following 34 years the kitchen at Delmonico's produced a body of culinary work that Ranhofer himself documented in a volume called The Epicurean, published in 1894, which contained approximately 3,500 recipes organized according to the principles of classical French cuisine and whose scope of reference reflected a professional intelligence that the foremost European critics of the period were prepared to take seriously. The restaurant had occupied several successive locations on Lower Broadway and on Fifth Avenue, each move tracking the northward progression of fashionable New York, and by the late 1880s, its principal location near Madison Square at 26th Street and Fifth Avenue had become the central venue for subscription dinners, debutante entertainments, political banquets, and private celebrations that formed the most visible portion of the elite social calendar. A formal dinner at Delmonico's or in a private house of the first rank during this period followed a sequence that had been established through the adoption of what was known as service à la Russe, the Russian system in which dishes were presented to each guest in succession, one after another, rather than arranged simultaneously on the table in the French manner that had prevailed in an earlier era. Under this system, a full dinner of 12 to 15 courses would proceed from oysters on a half shell, served cold, often with horseradish and mignonette sauce, accompanied by dry sauternes or pale sherry, through one or two soups, a fish course, a series of entrees, a substantial roast, a palate-cleansing sorbet, a game course, a salad, one or more desserts, and finally coffee, fruit, and bonbons over an interval between 2 and 3 hours at the table. The wine changed with each principal course. A Chablis or Montrachet with the fish, a mature claret or Burgundy with the roast. Champagne served in a continuous stream throughout from the soup course onward in a manner that made the management of individual consumption a matter requiring some personal vigilance. The Madeira or port that concluded the meal was a survival from an earlier era of dining, maintained in the more traditional houses, as a mark of the kind of continuity with established practice that the Knickerbocker families valued above most other social gestures. The specific dishes that occupied the middle courses of a formal Gilded Age dinner were drawn from a vocabulary of luxury ingredients whose names recur in the menus and social accounts of the period with enough frequency to suggest that they constitute a required lexicon of excellence. The terrapin stew prepared from diamondback terrapins harvested from the Chesapeake Bay had become by the 1880s the single most prized and most expensive dish on any serious formal menu, and its preparation involved precise set of procedures. The careful cleaning and division of the animal, the reduction of cream and Madeira sauce to an exact consistency, the final seasoning that Ranhofer documented in several variant forms in the Epicurean, and whose execution distinguished a kitchen of the first rank from every other. The canvasback duck, a migratory diving bird whose flavor derived from its diet of wild celery along the Chesapeake tidal waters, was considered the finest game bird available on the American market, and was served roasted with a brief cooking time that left the breast flesh a deep rose color, with a flavor that contemporaries consistently described as unlike any other bird then obtainable. The soft shell crab in season, the striped bass from the coastal waters near New York, and a range of imported delicacies, French truffles, English sole, foie gras arrived from Strasbourg packed in its own fat, completed the vocabulary from which a kitchen of serious ambition drew its materials. Charles Ranhofer had developed specific preparations for several of these ingredients that became attached to Delmonico's name and entered the wider American culinary record. Among them was a baked Alaska, a confection of ice cream encased in meringue, and passed briefly through a very hot oven, a combination of thermal extremes whose successful execution required precise timing, which he first prepared around the time of the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867, and described in the Epicurean under the name Alaska, Florida, the two territories representing the thermal contrast the dish embodied. He also developed a lobster preparation known today as lobster Newburg from a recipe concept brought to his attention by a sea captain named Charles Wenberg, who had encountered a similar dish on his voyages and described his principles to Ranhofer, who refined and added the preparation to the Delmonico's menu under Wenberg's name. When a dispute subsequently arose between Wenberg and the restaurant's management, Ranhofer removed the dish from the menu briefly and then returned it under a new name, Newberg, formed by rearranging the letters of Wenberg, a solution that preserved the dish while expunging the man, in that essence giving the preparation a name it has retained without alteration for more than 100 years. The table at which these dinners were served was itself an elaborate construction, requiring several hours of preparation before the first guest arrived. The cloth of heavy damask was laid with precision, and over it were arranged the ypperns and candelabra of the family silver, the Astor silver, the Belmont silver, the pieces that major families had commissioned from Tiffany and Company on Union Square or from the European silversmiths who supplied the English aristocracy, polished and arranged according to conventions governing the placement of each object that were as fixed and as precisely understood as the rules governing any other element of the occasion. Flowers supplied from private greenhouses during the winter months were arranged in low centerpieces designed not to obstruct the sight line between guests seated opposite each other across the table, and the varieties chosen favored pale and delicately scented specimens over heavily perfumed ones that might compete with the smell of the food. At the most elaborate entertainments, the central space of the table was occupied by constructions of more theatrical character, miniature landscapes of moss, flowers, and mirrors arranged to suggest a lake's surface with small objects afloat upon it, gilded bird cages containing live songbirds, or architecturally ambitious arrangements of tropical fruits and hothouse blossoms, whose cost in the middle of a New York winter was itself a legible statement about the resources at the host's disposal. Conversation at table followed rules whose observance distinguished the socially practiced from the socially uncertain as clearly as any other single element of the evening. The established convention required that each guest address the person on their right during the first portion of the dinner and the person on their left during the second, the transition being signaled by the hostess at a moment of her choosing, generally somewhere between the entree and the game course. The subjects appropriate to a formal dinner table were of a specific and somewhat limited character: the arts, travel, the activities of mutual acquaintances, horses and sport, and particular form of social commentary, who had been seen where, with whom, at what occasion, that served as the primary currency of social exchange in a world where the movements and associations of a small number of families constituted a kind of shared narrative whose episodes were followed with a collective attention that a larger public gave to public events. McAllister observed that the proper management of a dinner table required the hostess what he called the art of selection, the ability to assemble a company of persons whose individual characters and mutual relationships would produce a useful animation of conversation, and who would not sit in the silence of strangers insufficiently prepared by their hostess to find anything to say to each other. The competition between Delmonico's and the restaurant that Louis Sherry opened on Fifth Avenue in the late 1880s and expanded in 1898 to its celebrated location at 44th Street and Fifth Avenue introduced productive rivalry into the market for elite dining that raised the standard expected of any serious New York establishment and provided the social world with choice of venues whose distinct characters could be deployed strategically according to the occasion. Sherry's became, through the 1890s, the preferred setting for entertainments that sought a quality of novelty or elaboration that the more established character of Delmonico's did not easily accommodate. It was at Sherry's on the evening of the 28th of March, 1903, that Cornelius Kingsley Garrison Billings, a Chicago utilities magnate whose love of horses was the organizing passion of a life that his fortune made effectively unconstrained, hosted what became the most extensively discussed dinner entertainment of the entire Gilded Age period. The occasion was reported in the press accounts that appeared the following morning as a dinner for 36 guests, each of whom was seated not at a conventional table, but in a saddle mounted on a live horse stabled in Sherry's ballroom, which had been covered for the purpose with a layer of sod brought in from outside the city, so that the floor of one of Fifth Avenue's most fashionable venues was, for the duration of the evening, a small indoor pasture. Each horse stood beneath its rider, and the guests ate their dinner from trays fitted to the pommels of their saddles, while waiters dressed in riding costumes moved between the horses to serve each course. Champagne was supplied through rubber tubes connected to bottles carried in the saddlebags, a system that prioritized the theatrical over practical. The horses had been brought to the ballroom floor via the restaurant service elevator, a logistical detail that the press accounts noted with some appreciation as a feat of planning that must have required its own measure of preparation and persuasion. The estimated expenditure on the evening, including the horses, the sod floor, the decoration of the room with greenery and stable equipment to suggest an outdoor setting, and the dinner itself, was placed by contemporary accounts at approximately $50,000, a figure that in 1903 represented a sum well in excess of the annual income of the great majority of working Americans. The figure who most visibly embodied a particular strand of Gilded Age dining culture in the public imagination was James Buchanan Brady. Known almost universally by the nickname Diamond Jim, derived from the elaborate jeweled sets he wore at public appearances, which in total were valued by contemporary estimates at between $1 and $2 million. Brady had made his fortune as a salesman of railroad equipment and held no formal social standing within the world of the 400, but his connection to the restaurant life of New York and his sustained friendship with the actress and singer Lillian Russell place him at the intersection of the commercial entertainment world and the dining culture of the gilded elite in a way that produced a public persona of considerable visibility. His appetite, reported with a consistent mixture of admiration and mild disbelief by the journalists who covered the social and restaurant scenes of the period, was described in terms suggesting a relationship with food whose scale defied ordinary comprehension. He was said to consume at a single dinner, sitting a sequence of courses whose collective volume and caloric content would sustain an ordinary person for several days, moving from the oysters through the terrapin through the canvas-back duck through the desserts with an attention and appetite that did not diminish from beginning to end. His regular table at Delmonico's and at the restaurant that Charles Rector had opened on Broadway in 1893, a restaurant in which Brady had reportedly encouraged Rector's establishment by promising his own patronage, was as much a recognized feature of the New York dining landscape as any official institution of the period. The distance between the tables at which Brady and his contemporaries sat, and the conditions existing within walking distance of Fifth Avenue, was a distance that the social world of the 400 managed with a practiced efficiency of a system whose exclusions have been built so deeply into its physical arrangements that they no longer require conscious maintenance. Jacob Riis, a Danish-born journalist who had spent several years in the 1880s documenting conditions in the immigrant tenement districts of the Lower East Side, for New York Tribune, published How the Other Half Lives in 1890, a work illustrated with photographs taken in the tenement rooms, alleys, and cellar lodgings of the district, and whose detailed descriptions place before a middle-class reading public the specific material conditions of life in a city that, from a vantage point of a Delmonico's dining room, might as well have occupied a separate continent. Riis described families of 6, 8, and 10 persons sharing two-room apartments on the 4th or 5th floor buildings that housed more than 100 residents, their water supply drawn from a single courtyard pump, their work conducted by piecework in the same rooms where they slept, their diet consisting primarily of bread, potatoes, and salt fish purchased in the street carts that served their blocks. A family of 4 in the tenement districts of the early 1890s spent on food in an entire week an amount that would not have covered a single bottle of claret at Delmonico's during a dinner whose other expenses, taken together, ran to several $100s per person. The two worlds did not interact, and the physical and social architecture of the city had been organized in every particular to ensure that they did not. What the dining rituals of the Gilded Age elite expressed, in their accumulated and deliberate detail, was a proposition about the relationship between money and civilization, that the family capable of serving a terrapin dinner of 15 courses in a dining room hung with old master paintings, attended by liveried footmen, and accompanied by wines whose labels testified to decades of European cellaring, was not simply wealthy but refined, and that the refinement was itself a justification for the wealth that had produced it. It was a proposition that certain other Americans, examining precisely the same evidence from a different position, found considerably less persuasive. And it was through the institution of marriage, perhaps even more than through the institution of the dinner table, that the families who had built this world sought to give a permanence and a legitimacy that no quantity of terrapin and champagne could, in the end, entirely secure. The practice of arranging marriages between wealthy American families and the titled aristocracy of Britain and continental Europe was not, in the 1880s and 90s, a casual or incidental feature of Gilded Age social life. It was a recognized institution, pursued with deliberate strategy by families on both sides of the Atlantic, and discussed with striking frankness in the social press of both countries as a transaction whose terms were primarily financial and whose romantic Dimensions, where they existed, were understood to be a secondary consideration. Between approximately 1870 and 1914, estimates compiled by social historians suggest that more than 400 American heiresses entered marriages with members of the British and European aristocracy, transferring in the process a cumulative sum that contemporary calculations placed at approximately $220 million in personal fortunes and marriage settlements from American industrial families to European title ones. The women who participated in these arrangements were known in the British press as dollar princesses, a term that carried an affectionate condescension whose implications were not lost on the women described. Several whom wrote or spoke in later life at considerable length about the experience of being valued primarily as a financial instrument in a transaction conducted almost entirely by others on their behalf. The conditions that made British aristocratic families willing partners in these arrangements had been developing for several decades before the first major wave of transatlantic marriages in the 1870s. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 had removed the protective tariffs that had sustained the profitability of British agricultural land for several generations, and the agricultural depression that followed, deepening through the 1870s and 1880s as American grain, transported across the continent by railroad and arriving at British ports at prices domestic producers could not match, had reduced the rental income from the great landed estates by amounts that had made their continued maintenance economically impossible without an external source of capital. The great ancestral houses of England, each one staffed by dozens of servants, each surrounded by farms, gardens, and managed landscapes requiring constant expenditure, had in many cases become financial liabilities of the most pressing kind, their owners sustaining them through a combination of reduced expenditure, deferred repairs, and an increasingly anxious search for the marriage alliance that might restore their financial position without requiring the sale of the properties that defined both their social identity and whatever remained of their political authority. Blenheim Palace, the seat of the Dukes of Marlborough in Oxfordshire, was among the most prominent examples of this condition. The palace had been built in the early years of the 18th century as a gift from the English nation to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, in recognition of his military victory at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, and the building that Sir John Vanbrugh designed over nearly 2 decades of construction was one of the most extensive private residences in England, covering more than 3 acres of floor space and housing a collection of paintings, furniture, and decorative objects assembled across 8 successive generations. By the 1880s, the estate had entered a period of sustained financial difficulty from which successive dukes had been unable to extract it without selling portions of the very collection they had been entrusted to preserve. The 9th Duke, Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, who inherited the title in 1892 at the age of 20, found the palace's fabric in a state of considerable disrepair and its finances in a condition that, without a substantial external source of income, offered little prospect of improvement by any means available within the ordinary resources of the state. The American woman who entered the world of the British aristocracy earliest and most visibly was Jeanette Jerome, known throughout her life as Jenny, the daughter of Leonard Jerome, a New York financier, newspaper investor, and horse racing enthusiast whose speculative career had produced a substantial fortune and whose 3 daughters would each make marriages of social consequence. Jenny Jerome met Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, at a reception during the Cowes Regatta on the Isle of Wight in August of 1873, and within days of that first meeting the two had agreed between themselves on a course of action that both their families received with the wariness such a rapid determination would naturally produce. The formal settlement negotiations that followed were conducted over several months, and at times with considerable friction. Leonard Jerome eventually agreed to settle an annual income on his daughter drawn from capital he would place in trust, while the Churchill family contributed a smaller sum from their own considerably reduced resources. The marriage took place in April of 1874 at the British Embassy in Paris, and Jenny Jerome Churchill spent the following decades as a figure of genuine prominence in London political and social life, her American origins a persistent element of the commentary that followed her while remaining, in the estimation of most who knew her, entirely secondary to the force of character with which she had negotiated an unfamiliar world. The negotiation of the settlement was a central practical transaction of any transatlantic marriage arrangement, and it was conducted with a directness about money that the social conventions of both countries generally work to suppress in other contexts. American fathers entering these negotiations were dealing with counterparties whose requirements were often specific and whose financial situations allowed little flexibility about the form and scale of what was expected. The American families, for their part, were purchasing something that no quantity of industrial capital could supply through domestic arrangements alone: the formal social standing that an ancient title conferred, together with the physical evidence of ancestral continuity that a great English house represented, standing in explicit contrast to the newness of the American fortunes. However vast those fortunes might be, the exchange was, in this sense, genuinely reciprocal, even if the currencies on either side were of entirely different kinds, and the families who conducted these negotiations understood its logic with complete clarity even when, in their public statements, they were careful to present the arrangement in the vocabulary of mutual affection and personal inclination. Mary Victoria Leiter, daughter of Levi Leiter, the Chicago merchant who had formed a commercial partnership with Marshall Field in the 1860s and accumulated a fortune estimated at approximately $30 million before his retirement, met George Nathaniel Curzon, a rising figure in British conservative politics, during a social visit to Washington in 1891. Curzon was already marked within the political establishment as a man of exceptional ability and exceptional ambition, qualities that would eventually carry him to the Viceroyalty of India in 1898 and to the office of Foreign Secretary after the First World War. The settlement Levi Leiter provided for the marriage, which took place at the Church of St. John's in Washington in April of 1895, was understood by both parties as a contribution to a political career as much as to a domestic household, furnishing Mary Curzon with an independent income sufficient to maintain a style of life appropriate to her husband's public position. Mary Curzon died in 1906 after several years of declining health, and the grief that Curzon expressed in letters written in the weeks that followed, whose emotional directness was somewhat at variance with the general conventions of his class, suggested that whatever the initial character of their arrangement, the marriage had developed over 11 years into something the terms of its negotiation had not necessarily anticipated. The match concluded in 1878 between Marietta Stevens, known in the social world as Minnie, and the daughter of the New York hotelier Perron Stevens, whose social ambitions had made her a persistent figure in the New York season, and Sir Arthur Henry Fitzroy Paget, an officer in the British Army, represented the culmination of a social project that had occupied Mrs. Perron Stevens for the better part of a decade. Pauline Whitney, daughter of William Collins Whitney, the New York attorney who had served as Secretary of the Navy under President Grover Cleveland and whose fortune derived from urban streetcar franchises, married Almeric Hugh Paget in 1895, extending the reach of one of New York's most politically connected industrial fortunes into the English aristocratic world. Maud Alice Burke of San Francisco, whose personal resources derived from her family's California interests, married Sir Back Cunard of the Cunard Shipping Line in the same year, becoming over the following decades one of the most active hostesses in London society under the name she eventually adopted, Emerald Cunard. Each of these marriages followed the same broad structural logic: American capital exchanged for European title and social standing, while presenting its own specific terms, its own particular emotional character, and its own negotiated relationship between the expectations of the families involved and the inclinations of the people whose lives the arrangement would govern. The marriage that attracted more public attention than any other of its kind, and that has remained the most extensively documented of all the transatlantic unions of the Gilded Age, was a match between Consuelo Vanderbilt and the 9th Duke of Marlborough, solemnized at the Church of St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue on the 6th of November, 1895. Consuelo Vanderbilt had been born in March of 1877, the only daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva Smith Vanderbilt, and had grown up in the great houses her parents had built: the mansion on Fifth Avenue, the marble house at Newport, in an atmosphere of material comfort and emotional constraint in approximately equal measure. By the time she was 18, she had formed an attachment to Winthrop Rutherford, a New York lawyer of established family and considerable personal attractiveness, who was some years her senior, and the reciprocal nature of this attachment was a matter of sufficient social knowledge that it had reached Alva Vanderbilt's attention well before any formal understanding between the two young people had been established. Alva Vanderbilt's response to the Rutherford attachment was resolute and entirely consistent with the broader project of social and dynastic positioning that had occupied her since her arrival in New York society in the early 1880s. She had divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt in March of 1895, in itself a sensational development within a social world that treated divorce with a degree of public disapproval that had only recently begun to moderate, and the separation had given her both the legal independence and, in her own estimation, the particular urgency to see Consuelo established in a position whose security would not depend on the continued goodwill of any other party. Contemporary accounts, including Consuelo's own memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1953, nearly 6 decades after the event it describes, record that Alva employed a range of measures to separate her daughter from Rutherford and bring her compliance with the Marlborough arrangement. She restricted Consuelo's movements and correspondence, enforced a physical separation between her daughter and the man she wished to marry, and communicated to Consuelo, in terms that her daughter recalled with undiminished precision many decades later, that she was prepared to take the most extreme action she could contemplate should the attachment continue. Consuelo's testimony during the Catholic Church annulment proceedings of 1926 stated that the marriage had been contracted under conditions of coercion, and the Church's eventual grant of annulment on that basis constituted at least a partial legal acknowledgement of the circumstances under which the match had been made. The financial terms of the Marlborough settlement were reported in the American press with a specificity that neither party appeared to have made any great effort to prevent. The arrangement placed in trust for the ninth Duke approximately $2.5 million in Beech Creek Railroad stock, yielding an annual income of approximately $100,000, and the terms provided for continuation of this arrangement regardless of the subsequent condition of the marriage. The Duke was receiving, under these terms, an annual income from American railroad investment sufficient to fund the most extensive program of restoration that Blenheim Palace had undergone since its original construction: roof repairs, structural work on the east wing, the redecoration of the principal staterooms, and improvements to the estate's drainage and water systems that occupied much of the first decade of the marriage. The painter John Singer Sargent was commissioned to execute a large-scale family portrait of the Duke and Duchess with their 2 sons, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, born in 1897, and Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill, born in 1898, a work that now hangs in the Long Library at Blenheim, and that was received when exhibited in London as among the more significant formal portraits Sargent had produced in a career already distinguished by such commissions. Consuelo herself had wept throughout the ceremony at St. Thomas's Church, a detail recorded by more than one observer present in the nave that morning, and the wedding breakfast held afterward at the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue was described in newspaper accounts as an occasion whose social magnificence was not fully matched by the emotional atmosphere among those closest to principals. The marriage endured in a formal sense until the couple's legal separation in 1906, though those who had observed the household at close quarters suggested that any genuine domestic partnership between the two had concluded well before that date. Consuelo eventually remarried, following the Church's annulment, the French aviator Jacques Balsan, and her later account of the years between the wedding at St. Thomas's and the formal separation carried the unmistakable quality of a person describing a situation that had been imposed on her from outside and whose costs she had been required to bear, without having made a calculation that those costs were acceptable. The novelist Edith Wharton, who had grown up at the margins of precisely the social world and devoted much of her literary career to examining its mechanisms and their human costs, observed in her memoir, A Backward Glance, that the great houses of Fifth Avenue and Newport had provided the setting for a social experiment whose ambitions had substantially exceeded its understanding of what civilized life actually required of those who claimed to inhabit it. Her unfinished novel, The Buccaneers, whose central subject was a phenomenon of American heiresses seeking British aristocratic marriages, pursued this observation with sharpness that the social world it described would not have found entirely congenial. What the transatlantic marriages represented, in her reading of the evidence, was a form of cultural aspiration, the desire of a new world to purchase the outward forms of an older and more settled civilization, and the discovery, made at varying speeds and at varying personal costs by the women who had served as the instrument of that purchase, that the forms could be acquired, but that the condition they represented could not, in any fundamental sense, be transferred along with them. It was a discovery whose implications extended well beyond the marriage market itself, reaching into every other department of the social theater that the Gilded Age elite had constructed so carefully, and nowhere were those implications more directly tested than in the great public entertainments whose extravagance, through the final years of the century, had begun to attract a quality of attention that no amount of careful social management could indefinitely contain. The winter of 1896 and 1897 was a difficult one for the portion of the American working population whose circumstances left them with no margin against the effects of the economic contraction that had been tightening since the Panic of 1893. The collapse of several major railroad companies in 1893 and 1894 had sent a shock through the credit markets that depressed business activity for several years thereafter, and the effects on urban working people, concentrated particularly in the manufacturing cities of the Northeast and Midwest, had produced an unemployment rate that various estimates placed at between 15 and 18% of the industrial workforce by the midpoint of the decade. In New York, the settlement houses and charitable organizations established in the tenement districts during the preceding decade reported a sustained demand for basic relief that their resources were finding increasingly difficult to meet. And the winter of 1896 to 1897 was sufficiently cold to add the specific difficulty of fuel costs to the existing pressures on household economies already operating at or below subsistence. The social world of Fifth Avenue continued its seasonal program with an appearance of untroubled continuity, but the proximity of these two conditions, the charitable relief tables on Mulberry Street and the subscription dinner tables at Delmonico's on 26th Street, had become, by the early months of 1897, a subject of editorial attention that the newspapers were no longer content to leave unaddressed. Bradley Martin and his wife Cornelia Sherman Martin occupied a position in New York's social life that was comfortable and well established, but had never quite achieved the very first rank of the city's elite. Martin had inherited a substantial fortune and had supplemented it through marriage. Cornelia Sherman brought considerable wealth of her own to their union, and the couple maintained a large house at the corner of West 20th Street and Broadway, a property in Scotland called Balmacon, and a regular presence in both the New York season and the Newport summer colony. They were members in good standing of the world that Mrs. Astor and War McAllister had organized, known guests at the events that mattered and reliable hosts at entertainments of their own, but operating at a level that was, in the unspoken calculus of the 400, several gradations below the apex that the Vanderbilts and the Astors occupied without apparent effort. The ball they proposed to give in the winter of 1897 was, among other things, an attempt to resolve the positioning through an act of entertainment of sufficient scale and spectacle to place the question of where the Martins ranked in the social hierarchy beyond any further needed discussion. The stated justification that the Martins offer for an entertainment of this scale in a period of visible economic hardship was a philanthropic one. By employing the dressmakers, costumiers, florists, musicians, caterers, and decorators required to produce such an event, they argued they would be introducing money into the economy at a point where it would benefit those most in need of it. The argument was reported in the press and in subsequent accounts of ball with varying degrees of seriousness, and it represented an early appearance of rationale that the very wealthy have found serviceable in a number of historical contexts. The proposition that conspicuous expenditure is, at some sufficient level of abstraction, a form of public beneficence. Frederick Townsend Martin, Bradley Martin's brother and a close observer of the social world his family inhabited, wrote about the occasion in his memoir, The Passing of the Idle Rich, published in 1911, observing that the argument had struck him even at the time as somewhat strained, and that it had not in any case survived its first encounter with newspaper opinion. The ball was held on the evening of the 10th of February, 1897, at the Waldorf Hotel on Fifth Avenue at 34th Street, a building that had opened in 1893, and that represented, in the scale and quality of its public rooms, the most ambitious hotel construction yet undertaken on the island of Manhattan. The ballroom and connected reception rooms had been decorated in the weeks preceding the event to suggest the appearance of the Palace of Versailles during the reign of Louis XIV, a transformation achieved through the installation of banks of fresh flowers, mirror panels, and decorative elements acquired from Europe at considerable expense. Approximately 700 guests received invitations, and their costumes, representing the courts and historical periods of Europe with a range and elaboration that had required months' preparation, included a number of garments commissioned from the House of Worth in Paris, each of which constituted, in its own right, an expenditure equivalent to the annual wage of a skilled urban tradesman. The hotel's rooms were illuminated throughout the evening by the combined output of its new electric chandelier system, whose pale bright light fell with democratic impartiality on the assembled costumes and on the faces of the guests beneath them in a manner quite different from the warmer and more selective light of candle flame that most of them preferred at private entertainments. The press response that began in the morning papers of the 11th of February and continued to the following week was the most extensive and uniformly critical public reaction that any single private entertainment had yet attracted in the United States. The expense of the occasion, estimated in various accounts at figures ranging from $100,000 to $369,000, was reported in a national and international press that made no effort to separate the facts of the evening from their editorial implications. The Reverend William Rainsford of St. George's Episcopal Church on Stuyvesant Square, whose congregation included a significant number of the city's working poor, delivered a sermon in the days following the ball whose argument was straightforward, that the visible staging of a private entertainment of this scale during a period of documented public distress represented a moral failure of a character sufficiently clear that it required no extended theological analysis. Rainsford was not a radical social thinker, and the fact that his objection came in measured terms from a socially respectable pulpit gave it a quality of authority that more confrontational commentary would not have carried. The practical consequences for the Martins were immediate and specific. The city's tax assessors doubled the assessed value of their townhouse on West 20th Street within weeks of the ball, an adjustment understood by all parties to be a direct response to the public attention the occasion had attracted rather than a revised calculation of the property's market value. Bradley Martin issued a public statement defending the ball and reiterating its philanthropic rationale, but the combination of continued press criticism, the tax increase, and what appeared to be a sustained cooling in the social atmosphere surrounding the couple produced a decision to withdraw from New York. The Martins relocated first to London and then to their Scottish property, and they did not return to the city on any permanent basis. At a purely social level, the ball had achieved precisely its intended effect, placing the Martin name at the center of New York's most exclusive winter gathering with completeness that no previous entertainment they had given had approached. The cost at which this result had been secured was one they had not fully anticipated when the invitations were sent. The logic that had produced the Bradley Martin Ball continued to operate throughout the following decade, generating entertainments of comparable scale and comparable public consequence as the participants pressed against the limits of what the social theater of the Gilded Age could sustain. In January of 1905, James Hazen Hyde, the vice president of the Equitable Life Assurance Society, which his father, Henry Baldwin Hyde, had founded in 1859 as one of the largest life insurance companies in the United States, hosted a ball at Sherry's on Fifth Avenue styled as a reception at Versailles in the court of Louis XVI at an estimated cost of approximately $200,000. The theatrical elements of the occasion were executed with a level of ambition consistent with the theme. The rooms of Sherry's were transformed with scenery and decorations brought from Paris. The supper tables were arranged to suggest the gardens of Versailles, and the celebrated French actress Gabrielle Regine was brought from Paris to perform during the entertainment at a fee whose specifics the subsequent press accounts were careful to establish for their readers. The difficulty with the Hyde Ball was not primarily one of scale or taste, but of accounting. It was reported in the financial press, and subsequently confirmed by investigative reporting in several New York newspapers, that the considerable expense of the entertainment had been charged to the Equitable Life Assurance Society, whose policyholders, by any reasonable construction of their contractual relationship with the company, had not consented to subsidize the social ambitions of its vice president. The story attracted the attention of William Armstrong, a member of the New York State Assembly, who persuaded the legislature to authorize an investigation into financial practices of the major New York insurance companies, conducted beginning in the summer of 1905 by the attorney Charles Evans Hughes, who used the platform it provided to build a public reputation that would eventually carry him to the governorship of New York and a presidential candidacy. The Armstrong investigation produced a body of legislative reforms that substantially reshaped the regulatory environment for the insurance industry across the country, and James Hazen Hyde sold his controlling interest in the Equitable and departed for France, where he remained for much of the following 4 decades. The ball at Sherry's had, in a sense, purchased for it hosts an entirely different and entirely unwanted form of historical prominence. The entertainments for which Harry Lehr was most directly responsible represented a variant of the spectacle logic organized around deliberate incongruity, rather than the straightforward accumulation of expense. In Newport during the summer season of 1902, Lehr hosted a dinner at the request of Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, at which the guests of honor were dogs, the pets of the Newport colony's most prominent households, brought to the table dressed in small evening costumes, and presented with an elaborate meal of minced liver, stewed kidney, and other preparations deemed appropriate to canine digestion, served on dishes of the same quality used at the human tables arranged around them. The human guests, who had received their invitations in terms suggesting a formal evening entertainment, arrived to find their place cards arranged alongside those of the dogs. And the occasion that followed occupied an unusual position between genuine amusement and a quality of social vertigo that came from the realization that the same organizational energy normally devoted to the entertainment of the most exclusive company in America had been extended, without apparent irony, to a collection of lapdogs and miniature evening clothes. Elizabeth Drexel Lehr, who married Harry Lehr in 1901, and who observed the Newport entertainments from a position of immediate proximity throughout the years of their marriage, described the dog dinner in her memoir, King Lear and the Gilded Age, as one of the occasions that best illustrated what she termed the essential purposelessness at the center of the social world she had entered. The practice of providing favors at formal entertainments, gifts presented to each guest as a material memory of the occasion, had developed throughout the 1880s and 90s from the simple souvenir of a ball into something considerably more elaborate, and the competitive pressure that governed every other dimension of elite entertaining had been applied to this practice with equal force. In the more ambitious entertainments of the 1890s, the favor distributed to each guest at a private dinner or ball might be a small object of Tiffany and Company manufacture, a gold mesh bag with a jewel clasp, a silver calling card case, or an enameled cigarette case whose individual value, multiplied across a guest list of 200 or 300, represented a total expenditure sufficient to have furnished a comfortable annual income. At certain Newport entertainments, shallow trays of decorative sand were placed at the dinner table, and the exercise of sifting to the sand yielded a concealed favor, a jewel pin, a small gold locket, and an enameled bonbonniere, whose discovery was intended to produce in each guest a particular pleasure of finding something unexpected in an unexpected location, transposing into formal dining room a quality of domestic informality that the otherwise rigid structure of the occasion did not otherwise permit. The ingenuity applied to these contrivances was genuine and considerable, and it reflected the broader problem that confronted the most serious entertainers of the period. Given that every material comfort was available and familiar, the challenge of producing a novel experience for guests who had experienced everything required a quality of imagination that expenditure alone could not supply. It was into this world of systematized and competitive display that Thorstein Veblen introduced, in the summer of 1899, the theoretical framework that would come to serve as the most persistently cited analysis of its mechanisms. Veblen was a Norwegian-American economist and social scientist who had completed his doctoral work at Johns Hopkins and Yale and was teaching at the University of Chicago when he published The Theory of the Leisure Class, a work that combined the analytical apparatus of economic theory with an anthropological attention to social ritual and a satirical tone of such sustained and perfectly controlled flatness that its targets occasionally required some consideration to determine whether they were being described or dissected. The book's central argument was that in an advanced industrial society, the primary social function of wealth was not its use in production or in straightforward consumption, but its display, the communication of the fact of its possession to an audience capable of reading and responding to the signals that such display produced. The term Veblen coined for this practice, conspicuous consumption, entered the English language with a directness of application to its subject that few theoretical coinages achieve, capturing in 2 words a social phenomenon whose previous description had required considerably more. Veblen extended his analysis to a second category he called conspicuous leisure, the deliberate and publicly visible abstention from productive work, as a demonstration that one's resources were sufficient to sustain life without it. In the world of the 400, conspicuous leisure was as rigorously observed as conspicuous consumption. A woman of the first social rank was not expected to perform any remunerative labor, any household work, or, in the most strict interpretations of the standard, any task requiring sustained physical effort that could be associated with the conditions of working life. The management of this standard required, paradoxically, a very great deal of organizational effort. The effort of managing servants, directing social schedules, overseeing household accounts, and maintaining the continuous social performance that elite standing required. But that effort was a kind the code demanded to be rendered invisible, performed in such a way that it left no trace suggesting that anything resembling work had been done at all. The seamlessness of the performance was itself, under this logic, the highest evidence of refinement. The family whose hospitality appeared to cost it no effort had achieved a level of social mastery that the family still visibly straining to produce the same effects had not yet reached. What the entertainments of the 1890s and early 1900s revealed, in their accumulated scale and the quality of public response they attracted, was a social system that had reached a condition its own internal logic could not indefinitely sustain. The resources required to maintain the standard display that the most competitive participants had established were sufficient to attract a quality of critical scrutiny that the families involved could not manage through the social mechanisms at their disposal, and the political and regulatory consequences that followed the high ball suggested that the theater of excess had acquired an audience beyond the one for whose benefit it had originally been staged. The physical machinery of the world this theater had produced, the houses, the staffs, the seasonal migrations, and the daily operations that sustained them all, continued to function through the first years of the 20th century with an appearance of permanence that somewhat concealed the degree to which the conditions that had made it possible were already, in certain important respects, beginning to shift. The physical infrastructure that sustained the daily operations of the Gilded Age elite extended well beyond the houses in which they slept and entertained. The seasonal migrations these families undertook between their various properties, from the Fifth Avenue mansion to the Newport cottage in late June, from Newport back to the city in September, from New York to warmer winter destinations in the Carolinas, or in Europe during January and February, require machinery of personal travel that only a very large fortune could sustain, and the competitive impulse that governed every other department of the social world was applied to the arrangement of private transportation with an energy and expenditure that produced, by the late 1880s, a category of personal mobility without precedent in American experience. The private railroad car was the most practically significant of these arrangements, and its ownership communicated as directly as almost any other single possession about the scale of its holder's resources. A fully fitted private car of the 1880s and 90s was in its organization and finished a mobile version of the domestic interiors its owners inhabited during the season. A drawing room paneled in mahogany or cherry wood with upholstered seating along both sides, a separate dining compartment whose table could receive a formal meal of 6 or 8 courses served on the car's own china and silver. Sleeping compartments fitted with berths of sufficient width to allow genuine rest, rather than merely the simulation of it, and a kitchen at the rear of the car operating under the direction of a private cook who traveled with the car and produced meals during long journeys whose standard was expected to match that of the household's principal kitchen. J. Gould maintained a private car on his Missouri Pacific Railroad that contemporary accounts described as among the most elaborately fitted then in service, its woodwork inlaid with contrasting veneers, and its observation platform fitted with canvas awnings that could be extended against the heat of southern and western travel. William Collins Whitney, whose fortune derived from urban streetcar franchises in New York and whose household arrangements were considered by contemporaries among the most carefully managed of any family of the period, maintained a private car that traveled with its own complement of servants and that could be attached on request to the schedules of the principal Eastern lines. The annual cost of maintaining and operating a private railroad car, staffing, provisioning, mechanical upkeep, and the track fees payable to the railroads over whose lines it traveled ran, by contemporary estimates, to figures of between $10,000 and $25,000 a year, a sum representing the full annual earnings of between 10 and 25 skilled industrial workers of the period. The private steam yacht represented the maritime equivalent of the private railroad car, and had developed through the 1880s and 90s into a vessel of size and appointment bearing more resemblance to a small ocean liner than to any conventional pleasure craft. John Pierpont Morgan, the banker and financier whose control of the capital markets of the eastern United States made him the single most powerful private financial figure of the Gilded Age, maintained a succession of private yachts under the name Corsair throughout his adult life, each substantially larger than his predecessor. The third Corsair, launched in 1898 and measuring 304 feet in overall length, carried a permanent crew of approximately 85 men and was fitted with a library, a formal dining saloon, several private staterooms, and a degree of mechanical sophistication in its propulsion and navigation systems, representing the most advanced marine engineering commercially available at the time. Morgan used the Corsair as a retreat from the demands of his financial and social life in New York, conducting business meetings on its decks when in harbor and cruising the northeastern coastline during the summer months with a degree of privacy that was, given the size of the crew required to operate the vessel, substantially qualified. A remark attributed to him in various forms across several decades of social commentary, that a man who needed to ask what it cost to own a yacht could not afford one. Enter the general vocabulary of the period as a summary of the financial logic governing this entire category of expenditure, though its precise origin has been disputed by subsequent historians. James Gordon Bennett Jr., who had inherited the New York Herald from his father in 1867 and managed the paper with an eccentricity of editorial judgment that produced, at intervals, both genuine journalistic achievement and considerable institutional disorder, maintained a private yacht whose scale exceeded Morgan's in at least one notably discussed particular. The Lysistrata, launched in 1900 and measuring 314 feet in length, was fitted with a padded stateroom adjacent to the main saloon that housed an Alderney cow kept aboard to provide fresh milk throughout Bennett's extended voyages, an accommodation whose specificity contemporaries found sufficiently striking to cite regularly as a reliable index of the more particular dimensions of yacht ownership at this level of the market. J. Gould's yacht the Atlanta, a vessel of somewhat smaller dimensions but comparable interior finish, was used primarily along the northeastern coastline and occasionally for longer passages, and those who had observed Gould on the water noted that he found in the yacht's relative seclusion a quality of privacy that the demands of his professional and social life on shore did not easily provide. The daily experience of a woman of the highest social rank during the New York season followed a schedule organized around the requirements of visibility and social management with completeness that left very few waking hours unclaimed by some form of obligation. She would typically rise between 9 and 10 in the morning, take a light breakfast in her sitting room attended by her lady's maid, and spend the first portion of the morning on correspondence, the notes, acceptances, regrets, and social communications whose volume during the active season could run to 20 or more items on a single day, and on planning the day's arrangements with the housekeeper and cook. Calling hours ran from approximately 11 in the morning to 1 in the afternoon, during which she would either receive visitors in her own drawing room or travel by private carriage along Fifth Avenue to make calls at the houses of others, following a sequence whose order reflected the careful social cartography of obligation and precedence she maintained continuously and entirely without written reference. Luncheon, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, was a lighter meal than dinner, and was frequently given for a company of women whose husbands were occupied with business, providing occasion for the kind of detailed social exchange whose informality the more structured dinners of the evening did not permit. The process of dressing for the evening required between 1 and 2 hours of the lady's maid's full attention, and the selection of the appropriate gown from the season's wardrobe, each dress suited to a specific category of occasion, from the opera to the private dinner to the subscription ball, was itself a decision informed by a detailed knowledge of what other women of the first social rank would be wearing at precisely the same event. The children born into these families were raised according to arrangements reflecting the same principles of studied separation from ordinary life that governed every other dimension of their parents' domestic organization. In the nurseries of the great Fifth Avenue houses and the Newport cottages, English or French governesses presided over the early years of a child's education, supervising lessons conducted in French, a language considered as essential an accomplishment as any other in the social world whose most prestigious cultural references were predominantly European, alongside the rudiments of history, drawing, and music. Young men of the family were sent in adolescence to the New England boarding schools that provided an institutional framework for consolidation of social identities. The family home had begun. St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, founded in 1856, and Groton School in Groton, Massachusetts, founded in 1884 by Rector Endicott Peabody, who maintained a vigorous and morally demanding educational program. The number of Gilded Age parents found both admirable and, in his implicit criticism of the social world that paid its fees, somewhat unsettling. Young women of the family received their formal education at home from governesses and private tutors, supplemented by extended periods in Europe that were described in social accounts as cultural visits, and that were, in practice, a combination of genuine aesthetic and linguistic education, and a sustained presentation of the young woman to the European social world whose familiarity with her and whose favorable opinion of her character it was practically useful to secure before the more formal negotiations of her eventual marriage arrangements were begun. The clothing that constituted a complete wardrobe for a woman of the highest social rank represented one of the most significant and most carefully managed categories of personal expenditure in this social world. The House of Worth on the Rue de la Paix in Paris, founded by the English-born designer Charles Frederick Worth in 1858 and developed under his direction, and subsequently that of his sons Gaston and Jean-Philippe into the most prestigious couture establishment in the world, supplied the principal garments for the wardrobes of the New York and Newport elite throughout the period, and the annual spring visit to Paris for consultations and fittings was a fixed element of the social calendar for the women of these families. Charles Frederick Worth himself received his American clients in his private salon with a quality of professional authority that contemporary accounts suggest bordered on condescension. He is reported to have formed decisive opinions about which garments were appropriate to each client's figure and occasion, to have communicated those opinions with very little accommodation for disagreement, and to have regarded the considerable purchasing power of his American clientele as insufficient compensation for what he considered their occasional lapses of aesthetic judgment. A full season's wardrobe, the morning dresses, afternoon visiting costumes, carriage dresses, formal dinner gowns, and ball gowns required to dress a woman of the first social rank through the complete cycle in New York or Newport season, represented a total expenditure of between $15,000 and $30,000, a figure accepted by the families involved as an ordinary operational cost of social life, rather than an exceptional commitment of resources. The jewels that completed the formal ensemble were supplied primarily by Tiffany & Company, the firm founded by Charles Louis Tiffany on Broadway in New York in 1837, and developed across the following decades into the most prominent jewelry house in the United States. Charles Louis Tiffany had cultivated a particular expertise in acquiring and resetting the content of European aristocratic collections that circumstance had placed on the open market, and has purchased a substantial portion of the French crown jewels following the dissolution of the Second Empire in 1871, including pieces of documented historical provenance from the collections of the Empress Eugenie, gave Tiffany & Company a connection to the tradition of European royal adornment that its American clientele found precisely as compelling as Tiffany intended. The diamond necklaces, emerald parures, and ropes of graduated pearls that appeared in the formal portraits of the period, the singer's sergeant commissions, the Carolus Duran works that several families brought back from Paris, had in many cases passed through Tiffany's Broadway showroom, and the specific jewelry worn by the women of the 400 at the more closely observed events of the season was a subject of newspaper commentary that placed the personal adornment of the New York elite in a category of public significance well beyond the merely personal. The investigative journalism that developed as a distinct professional practice in the American press in the early years of the 20th century directed sustained and specific attention toward the industrial fortunes whose accumulation had made the world of Fifth Avenue and Newport possible. Ida Tarbell's examination of the Standard Oil Company, published in installments in McClure's magazine between 1901 and 1904, and subsequently collected as The History of the Standard Oil Company, documented in precise detail the business practices through which John Davison Rockefeller had assembled control of approximately 90% of the American oil refining industry, and the specificity of its documented evidence produced conclusions that Rockefeller's defenders found difficult to address through denial alone. Lincoln Steffens, publishing in the same magazine between 1902 and 1903, examined the connections between industrial wealth and municipal government in a series of articles whose accumulated evidence, collected as The Shame of the Cities in 1904, made a systematic case that the political arrangements sustaining American urban life had been substantially shaped by the commercial interests that occupied the blocks adjacent to the city halls ostensibly governing them. The work of Tarbell, Steffens, and a number of contemporaries writing in McClure's and in competing publications did not in itself produce legislative change, but it created and sustained a public understanding that made legislative change politically viable in progressive administrations of the following decade. The constitutional development that most directly addressed the financial foundations of the Gilded Age social world was the 16th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, ratified in February of 1913. Which granted Congress the authority to impose a federal income tax without apportioning it among the states by population, resolving the constitutional obstacle that had caused the Supreme Court to invalidate an earlier income tax in 1895. The Revenue Act of 1913 that followed imposed a graduated tax beginning at 1% on incomes above $3,000 and rising to a maximum of 7% on incomes above $500,000. These were rates whose immediate impact on even the largest fortunes was relatively modest, but the mechanism, once established, was available for legislative adjustment without further constitutional amendment, and the subsequent history of the federal income tax would demonstrate the full extent of its redistributive reach in ways the families of the Gilded Age had not, in the winter of 1913, any particular reason to fully anticipate. The event that most decisively disrupted the social world as it had been constituted proved to be not the income tax or the investigative press or the reforms of the progressive era, but the outbreak of the First World War in August of 1914. The great English houses to which American fortunes had been transferred through the transatlantic marriage arrangements became military hospitals and convalescent homes within months of the war's beginning, and the men who held the titles to which those fortunes had been attached were engaged in a conflict whose scale and character made the social theater of a Newport season of memory from a world that seemed, from perspective of the Western Front, to belong to an entirely different order of civilization. The House of Worth closed its Paris premises for the duration of the war. The ocean crossings that had been a routine element of the seasonal calendar became, under wartime conditions, undertakings of genuine uncertainty. The war also accelerated the social and legislative changes that the progressive era had initiated, producing by its conclusion taxation regimes in both the United States and Britain and a broad public disposition that were substantially less accommodating of unreflective private excess than the world of the early 1890s had been. The great houses along Fifth Avenue were demolished in a sequence extending from the early decades of the 20th century to the 1930s, replaced by the commercial buildings that the avenue's evolving economic character required. The William Henry Vanderbilt mansion at 645th Avenue was cleared around 1910. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 57th and 58th Streets, among the largest private houses ever built on the island of Manhattan, extending across a frontage of 2 full city blocks, was demolished in 1927. Its site prepared for commercial development with speed, offering little interval for reflection on what was being removed. The Newport cottages survived in somewhat better physical condition, their distance from the pressures of urban commercial development providing a margin of time that the Manhattan houses had not possessed, and several were eventually transferred to the Preservation Society of Newport County, which opened the breakers to the public in 1948. What remained of the world that these buildings had housed was, in the hands of that organization and others like it, transformed into a subject of historical examination, a body of physical evidence whose meaning could now be considered at remove from the social machinery that had once operated within it, and with attachment that proximity had never permitted. The term that Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner had applied to the post-Civil War decades in their 1873 satirical novel, borrowing the image of a thin gold surface laid over a base of metal as a summary of the era's relationship between appearance and actuality, proved more durable as a historical designation than either author had likely intended. The 4 decades between the consolidation of the great railroad fortunes and the summer of 1914 produced a social world of unusual intensity and unusual specificity, one whose physical evidence was built to last, and whose documentary record has been maintained with completeness that allows subsequent examination to proceed with degree of detail that the participants themselves might have found, in certain respects, surprising. The writers who engaged most seriously with this world, Edith Wharton, who had grown up within its boundaries and examined it from the inside with novelist precision and a participant's authority. Henry James, who circled at American and European dimensions from a position of careful aesthetic distance. Thorstein Veblen, who analyzed its economic logic with a flatness of tone that a century of subsequent social change has not rendered obsolete. Each identified, from their different positions, the same central question embedded in the marble facades and the guest lists and the terrapin dinners and the transatlantic marriage settlements. The question of what wealth is actually for, and whether the civilization it claims to be building bears any genuine relationship to the civilization whose forms and vocabulary is borrowed. That question was not answered by the income tax, or by the First World War, or by the eventual opening of the Newport cottages to the public, and it has not been answered since. The houses on Bellevue Avenue still stand in the salt air of the Rhode Island coast, their rooms preserved and documented, their proportions undiminished by the passage of time, the light on their pale marble facades in the long late afternoons of the Newport summer falling with the same indifferent clarity it has always brought to whatever it finds there.